This is Nightly Business Report with Tyler Matheson and Sue Herrera.
Bipartisan shift, a rare event in Washington. The president and Democrats, yes, Democrats, reach a deal to pass aid for Hurricane Harvey victims and avert a debt crisis, at least for now.
1-2 punch. If Irma hits while the country is still recovering from Harvey, what could happen to the economy?
Shifting gears, more people are renting out their cars, and big automakers are taking notice. Those stories and more tonight on Nightly Business Report for Wednesday, September 6th.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. An unusual thing happened today in the nation's capital. President Trump and Democratic leaders put aside their differences to reach a deal that solves some of Washington's biggest issues. In a meeting in the Oval Office, an agreement was reached that includes a 3-month extension of both government funding and a 3-month increase in the debt limit, while also providing hurricane relief money. House Speaker Ryan had called the Democratic proposal ridiculous. But then later in the day, the top Senate Republican, Mitch McConnell, said he supports the idea. Kayla Tausche has more on this reach across the aisle.
President Trump struck a deal with Democrats to provide hurricane relief, fund the government, and suspend the debt ceiling, but only until December 15th. The plan was first floated Wednesday morning by Democratic leaders. Hours later, the president agreed to support it at a White House meeting with top lawmakers. Republicans were planning a 3-month extension on spending, but wanted the debt ceiling raised through 2018. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer says his deal offers more certainty.
The fact that we're renewing the debt ceiling and we're going to do it with a date, not an amount, means there's ample room to deal.
Top Senate Republican Mitch McConnell said he would add the deal because it has the president's backing to a bill for hurricane relief expected to pass this week.
His feeling was that we needed to come together to not create a picture of divisiveness at a time of genuine national crisis.
The deal buys Congress 3 months to find common ground, but the issues are familiar turf for many bitter partisan battles in recent memory. Republicans were seen to have had an upper hand thanks to a slim majority in Congress, but many worry privately the White House's support for Democrats will put them on flat footing come December. For Nightly Business Report, I'm Kayla Tausche, Washington.
Let's get some context and perspective on today's D.C. developments from Brian Gardner. Brian is Managing Director at Keefe, Bruyette & Woods. Mr. Gardner, welcome. Good to have you with us. You know, Brian, this decision, unexpected to say the least, basically punts the budget and debt ceiling debate and who knows what else into December. Why do this short-term patch, and what does it mean for progress on tax reform?
It's a great question, why do it short-term? I think doing a short-term debt ceiling extension is just a bad idea, and it's going to put Congress in another awkward position in a couple of months. The timing of it is a little uncertain. It may actually go beyond December into next year. I do think that as you alluded to, Tyler, that the reason for doing this is to try and clear the decks for the rest of the fall so Congress can turn its attention to tax reform, which is the president's #1 priority, or at least it seems to be his #1 priority right now. I'm not sure it's going to work out quite as planned, and I think it could be counterproductive in the way they've handled it. I think there's going to be blowback from Republicans that will hurt his attempts to pass tax reform. But I think that's the reason why he did it, was to get tax reform back on track.
Now, if indeed things go along and we're now at that December deadline, is it going to be once again one of the race to the end of the year, the race to the 11th hour on these issues that will once again have to be addressed?
Yeah, I think there's a little confusion about how it may play out. Certainly the spending bills will come up in the middle of December, and there's going to be the threat of a government shutdown. There's no doubt about that. The debt ceiling's a little different. Remember, they're suspending the debt ceiling into December, but Treasury once again will have its extraordinary measures to manage the ceiling, manage the debt limit, and stay under it, as it has for the last couple of months. And those could actually last into the middle of 2018. So it might be a little bit longer term than what we're counting on. But certainly when we get into the holiday season, a government shutdown is going to be looming. I have no doubt about that. You know, I think we were expecting all along that it would be punted to year end, and this is playing out kind of how we expected.
Talk to us.
But I think each side is going to start to dig in its heels, and certainly conservative Republicans are going to dig in more. So I think most Republicans feel like they didn't get anything out of this, and they're going to want to have something to show for whatever happened today when they get to December.
Two questions apropos of what you just said. Did the Republicans get rolled on this? Did the president get rolled? That's number one. And number two, I gather that passing a full-year budget resolution, a budget, is really critical to get tax reform done. Why is that? So
I do think that the president capitulated on this. I don't think he got anything in return except for clearing the decks. Again, that's a judgment call in the White House's. Now, to the second part of your question, Tyler, on the budget resolution, for people who kind of don't get into budget geeky stuff here in Washington, a budget resolution is an outline. It's a roadmap. And usually people don't care. Even people in Washington don't really care about the budget resolution in most years. This year, it's critical because in order to get to the reconciliation rules and strategy that the Republicans need to pass tax reform, you have to pass a budget resolution. The budget resolution must include the reconciliation instructions. Therefore, if there's no budget resolution, there's no reconciliation. If there's no reconciliation, there's no tax reform. So these are conditions that build upon themselves to get to tax reform.
Thank you
and
for
so
explaining
getting the
it.
budget resolution done in the next couple of weeks is critical to getting to the tax bill.
Brian, thank you so much. Brian Gardner with Keefe, Bruyette and Woods.
Nearly $8 billion was approved by the House today for Hurricane Harvey relief. That includes $450 million for the Small Business Administration's disaster loan program. And that's important because, as Kate Rogers reports, a natural disaster can be devastating to mom and pop shops.
Some 40% of small businesses hit by flood disasters like Hurricane Harvey never reopen, according to the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Part of the reason, they're not covered. Most small businesses are covered by what's known as a business owner policy, or BOP, which does not include flood coverage. That can be obtained through the National Flood Insurance Program or through an excess flood insurance policy with a participating carrier, according to the Insurance Information Institute. Business owners that are in a disaster area may also be eligible for financial assistance from the Small Business Administration. The SBA has physical disaster loans available, as well as economic injury loans for small businesses, both with caps of $2 million. Homeowners can also apply for SBA disaster assistance and are eligible for up to $200,000, while renters, they qualify for about $40,000 in assistance. After the 2005 Gulf Coast hurricanes, including Katrina, the SBA approved $10.9 billion in funding for some 160,000 loans. After Hurricane Sandy, the SBA approved $2.5 billion for some 37,000 recovery loans. And even though the program is managed through the Small Business Administration, the majority of these loans were actually approved to homeowners and renters, not small businesses. While the damage from Harvey is still being assessed, the SBA is recommending all businesses and homeowners get their claims in as soon as possible, as it can take up to 4 weeks to get funding approved. For Nightly Business Report, I'm Kate Rogers.
Well, Hurricane Irma is one of the largest ever Atlantic hurricanes. It is roaring through the Caribbean, following a possible track toward Florida, and residents in that state are getting ready. Jackie DeAngelis is in Fort Lauderdale tonight.
At this Home Depot, lumber is flying off the shelves. Generators scooped up seconds after being put on the floor.
Generators came in this morning, 36 generators, and in space of 10 minutes, everything was gone.
And Bridget Hampton is expecting to spend about $400 to prepare her home from what could be an historic storm.
Supply wood, supplies, gas, want to make sure you have cash on hand, pet food, just everything that you could think of that might be helpful.
This same scene is playing out across Florida, where state of emergency has already been declared even before a clearer picture of the storm's direction is known.
I cannot stress this enough. Do not ignore evacuation orders. Remember, we can rebuild your home, but we cannot rebuild your life.
Hurricane Irma, which has already started to batter the Caribbean, is expected to make its way to Florida this weekend. Residents we spoke to are heeding the governor's warning, not taking any chances.
I view this as a practice run, so either it is going to be a serious storm and it was worth it, or I'll be ready for the next one.
Right now, people are preparing without panicking, and stores like this one are trying to keep the shelves stocked. But the locals are concerned because this could be one of the worst storms in the state's history. For Nightly Business Report, I'm Jackie DeAngelis, Fort Lauderdale, Florida.
And with Irma coming on the heels of Hurricane Harvey, could this be a 1-2 punch for the economy? Paul Walsh is Director of Weather Strategy at IBM Global Business Services, and he joins us now to talk about that. If indeed Irma takes the path that it is projected now and it does have a direct hit on Florida in the wake of Harvey, what kind of economic losses could we be looking at, Paul?
Oh, it could be basically a repeat of what we just had with Harvey. It's kind of a almost a worst case scenario here with this track, and the latest track continues to make a beeline straight for South Florida, straight for Miami, right up the coast and into Georgia, South Carolina. That path is literally a worst case scenario. And what makes it really a worst case scenario is the fact that this is coming, 7 or 8 days after we just went through with Hurricane Harvey, and to have those both happen at the same time just seems almost inconceivable.
This is a different kind of storm. One thing I notice is that it does seem to be moving a little more quickly than Harvey did. Harvey just kind of sat there. Number two, the predictions are that more relatively of the damage will come from wind than was the case in Harvey, where most of the damage was flooding. How does that change the insurability of some of the losses that are sure to be sustained?
Yeah, well, the area that it's targeting right now in Miami, in that area, is a very, very built-up area. There's a lot of properties. You're right that this storm will not be as big of a flood risk. However, there will be a big impact as it relates to the storm surge ahead of it. And if it's just funny, I just looked, Tyler, before I came in to check the weather forecast on weather.com for Sunday, and on that weather app, it's saying that winds will be 140 miles an hour for Sunday. And those kind of winds can cause tremendous damage. And it's just such a built-up area, and there's so much stuff in the way that the insured loss will probably be significantly higher than it was potentially with Harvey, and then the overall losses could be comparable or even worse. I mean, the estimates put out by Swiss Re, for example, is that we could see well over $100 billion from a track like this. So it's a big, dangerous, risky storm for us. And
I think the key word is big. When you look at the scope and the size of this particular hurricane, it is massive. So it's not just Miami. I was watching it. It basically will hit most parts of the state with either the residual winds on one part of the hurricane or on the backside of the hurricane. So the scope is so much bigger than Harvey.
That's right. And the path, it's following a path that we saw last year with Hurricane Matthew, but Hurricane Matthew took a jog to the right just a bit and kept the worst winds just offshore. And that possibility is still here. I mean, just a very slight shift in the track can change the trajectory of the damage from being catastrophic to being just severe. So we're hoping for that, but right now, I don't know, all the models are looking pretty grim.
Well, we will keep our eye on it. Paul, thank you very much. Paul Walsh with IBM Global Business Services. And a bit later in the program, Floridians may be watching the aftermath of Hurricane Harvey to avoid the biggest threat to victims in Houston, fraud and scams. That story coming up shortly.
Well, the agreement on the debt ceiling that we told you about earlier in the program helped lift the stock market. Investors had been concerned about the possibility of a government shutdown if that debt limit wasn't raised. The Dow Jones Industrials up 54 to 21,807, recouping some of yesterday's losses. NASDAQ gained 17, S&P 500 added 7.
Economic activity grew at a measured pace across the country. That's according to the Federal Reserve's Beige Book, which is a collection of anecdotal facts about the economy. The report indicated that labor markets remain tight and that there's no wage pressure. There is some concern of a slowdown in auto production. Several districts noted that sales were down and inventories were rising.
There are reports tonight that President Trump is unlikely to nominate Gary Cohn to become the next chair of the Federal Reserve. Cohn is currently the president's top economic advisor. He was reportedly on a short list of candidates to replace Janet Yellen if the president decides to make a change. But according to Dow Jones, his chances of leading the Fed dropped after he criticized the president's response to last month's demonstrations in Charlottesville. Separately, Federal Reserve Vice Chair Stanley Fischer is stepping down, citing personal reasons. His resignation is effective mid-October, and Vice Chair Fischer has been an advocate of maintaining post-crisis financial regulations.
Still ahead, why a controversial drug maker saw a double-digit rise in its stock price today.
New hope for those suffering from a rare disorder. Sarepta Therapeutics reported positive results from a clinical trial of an experimental medicine for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. That sent shares of the drug maker higher by nearly 14% in trading today. Meg Terrell with a look now at the new promise and Sarepta's controversial past.
Sarepta's experimental medicine is for patients with Duchenne muscular dystrophy, or DMD, a rare genetic disease that causes progressive muscle wasting. It can rob kids of their ability to walk before they're teenagers and can be fatal before age 30. Sarepta received FDA approval last year for the first medicine to treat DMD. Called Exondys 51, it targets genetic drivers of the disease affecting about 13% of patients, a few thousand people. Sarepta is now testing additional medicines to reach more patients. The results today were for one of those programs.
We had extraordinarily positive results. We were statistically significant on every one of these measures, really validating the approach that we're taking to treating DMD and hopefully a step forward in our mission to eventually treat all of DMD and all of the boys who are suffering.
The results topped Wall Street's expectations, driving Sarepta's stock higher. The company is the subject of one of the biggest controversies in recent FDA history. When Exondys 51 was approved last year, many questioned whether the data supporting it were strong enough to warrant approval. The studies on the medicine were run in a small number of patients and didn't prove a clinical benefit. Approval was based on an increase of a protein called dystrophin, important in the disease. Facing intense lobbying from the patient community, the FDA granted what it calls accelerated approval, requiring the company to prove in a confirmatory study that the drug confers a clinical benefit. If it doesn't, the FDA could pull the medicine from the market. Those results are a few years away. Analysts pointed out today that the new medicine helps produce more dystrophin than Exondys 51, suggesting it too should receive accelerated approval. But the controversy doesn't stop there. People also question Exondys 51's price, $300,000 or more a year per patient, a cost that Sarepta's CEO defends.
Sarepta is a small company, and we alone have already invested $1 billion fighting Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and we're not done yet. This is a societal question more than a Sarepta question. That fundamental question is, does it make sense? Is it worth the investment to find solutions for these devastating rare diseases that often are crushing to children more often than not? And the answer, obviously, for Sarepta is yes.
The market for Exondys 51 could reach as much as $600 million a year in the U.S., according to estimates from RBC Capital Markets. This next medicine targets a smaller proportion of patients, just 8% of those with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. Still, according to RBC estimates, that market could reach $400 million a year. For Nightly Business Report, I'm Meg Terrell.
United Continental slashes its outlook, and that's where we begin tonight's market focus. The airline warned passenger unit revenue would fall as much as 5% in the current quarter due to sales lost by Hurricane Harvey disruptions. United also said last month's threat from North Korea to strike the U.S. territory of Guam has caused demand to weaken in that area. Shares of United fell 1% to $60.33. Harvey's impact is also being felt by household goods maker Newell Brands. That company, which sells Rubbermaid storage containers, said nearly all of its resin suppliers located in Texas and Louisiana were not operational, and as a result, Newell lowered its profit forecast for the year. Shares were off 3% to $47.03.
The hotel search site Trivago said slower than expected revenue growth would cause the company to cut its full-year guidance. Trivago said it wasn't able to adjust its own spending to offset the revenue drop, and that hurt profits. Shares were punished today, dropping 16% to $12.49. And after the bell, the home goods retailer RH formerly known as Restoration Hardware, I thought that was just fine name, by the way, reported results that topped expectations. Same-store sales rose more than expected, and that prompted the company to raise its outlook for the year. Shares initially soared in after-hours trading, but they finished the regular day down fractionally at $49.42.
As Florida watches the skies for Hurricane Irma, Texas is still cleaning up from Hurricane Harvey and dealing with one of the worst effects: fraud, scams, and ripoffs. Scott Cohn is in Houston with a look at what they're facing and what potential victims of Irma can learn.
Here on Sage Hill Drive, this is the storm after the storm.
You can see the water line on some of these areas here.
Rosie Robledo got more than 2 feet of water in her South Houston home. Since the water went down, she and her husband have been trying to save what they can.
We're staging things that can be salvaged on our, on our lawns.
With most of their worldly possessions out here, they're having to fight off scavengers who think they can help themselves.
This is hard enough for people that have been affected, and this is personal, this is emotional, it's heartbreaking, it's your life turned upside down.
Same situation at the neighbors.
I've had to run off people picking through our stuff here, pilfering through it, and that's not cool.
Then there are the contractors going door to door to make a quick buck.
They're leaving business cards. What about helping someone? Taking out a rug, moving down the street.
This is just the first wave of what these and thousands of storm victims will deal with. Federal, state, and local law enforcement is on the scene looking for fake charities, consumer frauds, including crooked contractors, and schemes to rip off government aid programs like FEMA disaster assistance.
The reality is there's a lot of money to be made by these fraudsters after a disaster.
Authorities say the scams are remarkably similar in storm after storm after storm. And the bigger the storm and the more publicity, the bigger those frauds are. After Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans in 2005, government auditors found 16% of the emergency aid paid out in the first 6 months after the storm was lost to fraud. That's $1 billion. Contractor fraud was rampant. So was insurance fraud, identity theft, public corruption. More than 1,400 people arrested across the country by a joint disaster fraud task force. A similar task force is already at work here in Texas.
Know that if you are caught, the full weight of the law, both federal and state, will be upon you.
For victims of this and future storms, authorities say ask questions, demand identification. Don't give sensitive information unless you're sure you know who's getting it. Don't make rash decisions, and above all, be on guard. For Nightly Business Report, I'm Scott Cohn in Houston.
Coming up, if you can't afford your dream car, some have figured out a way by renting out their ride. In the sharing economy, people have become comfortable renting out things like a room in their house. And now a new trend is developing. People are now renting out their cars. The business is growing so fast that automakers from General Motors to Daimler-Benz are taking notice. Phil LeBeau has our story.
When Brian Rose bought his Tesla Model S 2 years ago, he took out a loan with a monthly payment of $1,500. Too much to handle? Not for Rose, who has cut that cost by renting out his Tesla a few days each month to total strangers.
I've been renting out. I've had about 60 trips over the last 2 years, and it's basically helped pay off all of the payments or depreciation on it, so it's as if I got to drive it for free up until now.
Rose rents out his Tesla through Turo, a car share company that features more than 160,000 vehicles on its app and website. Everything from a high-end BMW to a more basic Toyota Corolla, all being rented out by their owners, who are known as hosts.
I think a lot of our hosts have realized that, for
practically no cost, they can actually afford to own a nice car and make that ownership experience much more pleasant for their personal wallets.
German automaker Daimler-Benz is investing in Turo, which now has over 4 million members. The growth in car sharing has also caught the attention of General Motors, which started in Maven and is expanding to cities around the U.S. What started almost 20 years ago with Zipcar offering hourly rentals has grown in popularity, partially because the rising cost and hassle of owning a vehicle has convinced many they're better off renting for a day or two whenever they need a car or truck, which is good news for Brian Rose, who says he's made about $25,000 renting out his car.
Since I do about 200 a day, right now if I get a few rentals during the weekends of the month, then I might take in about half my monthly payment. But there were some months, if I got a longer rental, like a week or two, or in some cases where, a lot of like 2 or 3 day rentals during the month, like weeks, where I sometimes got like double what my payment was.
What about auto insurance for customers who rent through Turo? Like rental car companies, Turo offers it to cover any damage total strangers might do to your car. Phil LeBeau, Nightly Business Report, Chicago.
$25,000 he's made off of that.
I know. Our
Wow.
jaws both dropped at the same time. Well, hey, good for him. We'll follow that story for you. That does it for us tonight. I'm Sue Herrera. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for me as well. I'm Tyler Mathisen. Have a great evening, and we'll see you back here tomorrow.